Ladies and gentlemen, it's great to see you here. I'm just curious, how many have been at a previous lecture in our series? Fantastic, that's what this is about. And at the end of the series, we should all give you degrees. But it's really wonderful to have a role in the community of disseminating information, encouraging dialogue, and also engaging you with your ideas as well, so that you know you're part of this educational institution. Toward that end, I want to remind you that we have another lecture coming up next week, October 18th, and then there's a bit of a break. So I know you've gotten used to these as weekly events, but then we're leading up to the big finish, and that is going to be in the theater, and that is a Ukrainian dance and music troupe that will be here. And also, if you've gotten used to 6:30, that event will be at 7:30 p.m. And that, I'm sorry?
On November 1st?
On November 8th.
November 8th.
Yes. But we will be here next week for another talk by someone who was again Ukrainian, give us an insider view of talking about transcultural relations. And also engaging the community. For those of you interested in some daytime activities, we start our Scholarship program, which is in the library, and that will start with coffee, tea, and angry women in 18th century Britain. So I hope you come to that, and plus it's another incentive. We serve pizza and drinks at that, and that is in the library, and that is free and open to you as well. And in addition, I want to give a plug for our partners in the theater, Musical Masters, who will be participating here with us hosting Open Doors West Bend. Actually, that program is Friday and Saturday, but the Musical Masters here on campus will be Saturday morning. It's free, and they will be in the theater, and so you can see them there and have a preview if you want to come back for their performances for the Halloween season of The Addams Family. So we're entertaining you, we're educating you, and most important, we're seeing you and connecting to you. So I thank you very much for coming, and also for the support that you've given this campus, and I hope that you will continue. Toward that end, speaking of support for this campus, I do want to recognize our partners at the Washington County Campus Foundation, who are helping with this series and other events, and I'll probably tell you to come back, especially in the spring, for the Festival of the Arts, which they sponsor as well. So please give a shout out and applause to Joan Rudnitsky. She's also always glad to talk to you about donations if you'd like to enter in a conversation. I also want to recognize our faculty, since this is a community and educational institution connection here. I'm very glad to see many of them here. Many have spoken here and also lectured here. So will the faculty and emeriti as well, if you would stand up and be recognized for all that you've given to generations of students. And I also see the wonderful people who stood up, who you probably know very much in the community as well from performances, is Dr. Peter Jabot. And if you can shout out your planned winter concerts
Well, we have two concerts, one on December 2nd in the gym here, and it's with the Kettle Moraine Symphony. That one's a Christmas concert, and then the 10th of December is our Moraine Chorus concert, and we'll be premiering a 300-year-old German cantata, and a little string group, and the chorus.
And the acoustics are wonderful. It's really a delight for the ears as well as the eyes. So please keep coming back. Let us know the kinds of things you want to see as well. We're already starting planning for next year, indeed. So I'm not going to take more time, but I want to let you know about our robust and vibrant programming here, and also tell your neighbors and prospective students about the faculty and courses here. And for those of you who are more athletically minded, pickleball starts next week. So that's through continuing education if you also want to come here in the evening to play there. So with that, I want to give a great thank you for the committee that organized this, and helping to lead that committee is Dr. Dylan Bennett.
Thank you, Dean Bronner, and welcome everyone tonight. I did print my remarks, but I forgot the piece of paper, so I'm staring at my phone, so you'll have to excuse me. Tonight we welcome Professor Stephen Redd. His talk is titled U.S. National Security and the War in Ukraine. Professor Redd is an associate professor of political science at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, our big sister campus in the city. He has a PhD in political science from Texas A&M University. He is past president of the Foreign Policy Analysis section of the International Studies Association, and formerly an associate editor at Political Psychology. He has published in the American Political Science Review, which is the top political science journal in the world. He has also published in the Journal of Conflict Resolution, International Studies Quarterly, and Foreign Policy Analysis, as well as other publications. His research interests focus primarily on foreign policy decision-making and U.S. foreign and national security policy. Professor Redd.
Thank you, Dylan. I appreciate that. I do want to thank all those who made this evening possible. All those on committee. I've talked to Paul, and Dylan was the one who first extended the invitation to me, so I want to thank them. And I want to thank all y'all for being here this evening. Yes, I said all y'all because I am from Texas. And I found out that Paul is also from Texas. He went to Texas Tech, but that's okay. What I'm going to do tonight is, well, a couple things. Notice there's no Ukrainian flag behind me, but I do have the colors, okay? And I also have the suit and the tie. I'm going to start by sharing a little bit. For the last 15 years or so, I've taught a course at UW-M on U.S. national security policy. And in that course, we talk about U.S. national security crises. And basically what I've done over the years is I have 4 crises that I introduce to the students. We get some background information, and then they do some analysis about U.S. national security policy. And we have done, the 4 that we usually do is India, Pakistan. What if there's a war there? What should we do? Iran going nuclear. Okay, that's another one. China, Taiwan. China invades Taiwan. And then we also, of course, have done Russia invades Ukraine. Up until last year, that was always hypothetical. So when I taught the course this last spring, we had to switch things up and look at it. Well, here's what's happened. Here's what the administration has done. What do we do now? So that's kind of what I'm going to do this evening. This is a very complex topic. U.S. national security policy and what should we do or shouldn't we do in Ukraine? What are we going to do? What are the probabilities of success, failure, et cetera, et cetera? I'm going to try to keep things very straightforward. I'm looking forward to some interesting questions at the end of this presentation. So what I'm going to start with here is just some brief background. As we know, February 24th, 2022, Russia invades Ukraine. On March the 2nd, the UN General Assembly voted 141-5 to demand unconditional Russian withdrawal. 47 countries, including China and India, abstained or did not vote. The US, European Union, and others have imposed a series of increasingly severe sanctions on Russia and substantially increased security, humanitarian, and economic assistance to Ukraine. Let's talk a little bit about on the ground. And I've talked to some people as they came in, and I know that many of you have been following this daily. I'm going to again just hit some highlights because again the focus of my talk is going to be U.S. national security, not so much what's been happening day after day, week after week, month after month. As of 8/27/23, according to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, roughly 9,500 civilians have been killed and a little over 17,000 injured. Those certainly could be, based on what we know, oops, excuse me, I pressed the wrong button. There we go. Casualty reports, of course, vary wildly depending on who's doing estimating. As I was doing research on this, it was difficult to find reliable numbers. I attended part of Maria's talk last week, and she talked about Russian disinformation. Very difficult to figure out exactly what's going on the ground. The latest estimate by the New York Times, this was in August, was that in Russia you had 121,000 killed and 180,000 injured, approximately 300,000 total. In Ukraine, 70,000 killed, 120,000 injured, about 190. Close to 500,000 casualties combined in the last 18 months. Right? Keep in mind, though, that Russia has a 3-to-1 advantage on the battlefield and a much larger population from which to replenish its ranks. Right? All right, let's talk a little bit about aid for Ukraine. We know that the United States and many other countries have come to the aid of Ukraine. To date, the U.S. has directed approximately $77 billion in humanitarian, financial, and military assistance. 61% of this total, about $47 billion, is military aid. About 34%, roughly $26 billion, is financial aid. And 5%, roughly $4 billion, has been humanitarian aid. In early August of this year, the Biden administration requested an additional allocation of $24 billion for Ukraine. That has not been approved. It's not looking likely that it's going to be approved. The funding proposal was stripped from the recent legislation that Biden signed to keep the government running. So as of right now, there aren't any additional funds at least agreed on by Congress, and as we know, Congress holds the purse strings. That does not mean, though, that there isn't any continuing money for Russia, or excuse me, for Ukraine. The Biden administration has allocated $325 million in security assistance. And you might be asking, well, how is that possible? Because the executive branch is not supposed to have the power to expend funds. But what this is this $325 million utilizes the Presidential Drawdown Authority, it's called PDA, for Ukraine, meaning the Pentagon will take the weapons from existing U.S. stockpiles and transfer them to Ukraine. Okay. Let's talk a little bit now about U.S. national security. What I want to do here is make sure that we're speaking the same language, that we understand some basic terms. And I'm going to go over these briefly. I'm not going to spend a ton of time. So 2 important concepts. One is the national interest, which is the objectives of state policy in foreign affairs. Sounds straightforward enough, right? Well, the problem, though, is that national interests can refer to both the process and the objectives of U.S. national security policy. The range of goals and values policymakers may choose to pursue is virtually endless, right? The same cannot be said for the resources available. Prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, you would have been hard-pressed to find anyone who would argue that Ukraine's sovereignty was in the U.S. national interest, right? In fact, if you harken back to 2014 when Russia took Crimea, there was some comment in some quarters, but even President Obama himself said, please someone tell me where the protection of Crimea is in the U.S.'s national interest, okay? The U.S. and its leaders and people have long struggled to clearly define what sorts of actions are or are not in the national interest. In fact, that term, as I teach my students, that term is so vague that oftentimes leaders will use in the national interest to denote whatever it is they're doing, right? If we're doing action X or action Y, they'll say, well, this was in our national interest. But they haven't clearly defined exactly what that means, okay? So oftentimes it's used as a way to justify actions that are already being acted upon. Many people, Americans, favor a very narrow conceptualization of the national interest, focused primarily on the survival of the state, whereas many others prefer a more expansive definition, extending national interest to the interests of allies or other actors, economic interests, so on and so forth, membership in international institutions, etc. So, and I'm going to come back to this point at the very end of my lecture, just as a way to try to spur some further thought about what do we think is in the national interest versus not in the national interest, okay? And to put a bow on that, oftentimes the same people on either side, right? They are very restrictive in the definition of the national interest initially, but when something bad happens, then they want to expand that definition. So it's possible that we, me, and others, sometimes we find ourselves on both sides, right? So that's national interest. Let's talk a little bit about national security. National security is the ability of national institutions to prevent adversaries from using force to harm Americans or their national interests and the confidence of Americans in this capability. In order to be able to do this, that's going to require an expenditure of resources, right, which we just talked about are not infinite, they're finite. If you spend money in some places, sometimes you don't have money in other places. And as we were just recently reminded a few days ago, on the 7th, right, now we have a big hot fire in Israel, and now there's going to be a lot of angling for additional funds and resources to be sent and to help Israel. And in fact, I was talking with Paul beforehand, just saw the headline, the Biden administration has talked about tying funding to Ukraine to funding to Israel. Because remember, he's of one party, and the Republicans who control the purse strings are of another party, right? And they don't necessarily oftentimes, of course, see eye to eye on these types of things, right? So, both economically and militarily, we have to decide, right, what those expenditures of resources are going to be. And then we have to decide on the means of coercion, okay? Is that going to be a military means of coercion? Are we going to use diplomacy? What types of things are we going to do to try to make sure that we guarantee the safety or prevent adversaries from harming Americans, okay? These goals that are associated with the national interest, although to say that is being charitable, because most leaders don't have a set of goals per se. Presidents do, usually published in the first year or so of their presidency, a national security strategy where they outline the principles and the things that they believe in. But oftentimes things that happen on the ground change those, right? We could talk about, very quickly, George W. Bush. He had no thoughts about wars on terror when he first got into the White House, but 9/11 changed that very, very quickly, and he had to change his perspective on what the national security of the U.S. was going to be. Okay, so national security policy then constitutes a framework for describing and analyzing how a country provides security for the state and its citizens. Okay? So, two questions to think about as we move forward. To what degree, if any, should the U.S. be involved in the war in Ukraine? Okay? To what degree, if any, should we be involved in the war in Ukraine? Kind of already know the answer to that because we are involved, but there are many people who say we shouldn't be and they want to pull back. Okay? The second question is, given what the Biden administration and the Congress have already done to assist Ukraine, what is likely to happen going forward? And I might actually ask a third one, but we don't have time for all these. We have an election coming up in a little over a year. Depending on who gets elected, what would that look like? Okay? Who the candidates are going to be, what are their platforms? We could say we think we know, but we don't know that for sure, right? How might things change or stay the same, right? All right. So let's talk first about some general arguments related to U.S. national security and the war in Ukraine. And I'm going to present these in a kind of general order. One is the U.S. should cease providing any assistance to Ukraine. Okay? Some have argued that the U.S. should cease providing any more aid in any form, arguing that the war between Russia and Ukraine is not in the national interest of the United States. Okay? Some have argued that the U.S. should do less to assist Ukraine. The argument is that the United States is playing a dangerous game in assisting Ukraine militarily and confronting Vladimir Putin, the leader of a country with nuclear weapons, tactical, 2,000 tactical nuclear weapons, and lots of other strategic nuclear weapons, and who has made comments about not being afraid to use them if it's warranted. Obviously, that could simply be a bluff, but these are the sorts of games we don't want to find out afterwards. That's why the whole Cold War was premised on the fact that the two superpowers would not face each other because they had nuclear weapons, and you didn't want to find out what happens if deterrence fails. Okay? Others argue that the U.S. should pursue some middle ground. In other words, the status quo with respect to assistance to Ukraine. More or less, kind of what we're doing now. Although, what we're doing now is somewhat stalemated. I'll talk a little bit more about that. I talked about it just a minute ago. In terms of additional funding that the Biden administration wanted has not been granted. And it's not looking very likely that more money will be coming, at least anytime soon. Others argue the U.S. should do more to assist Ukraine. Okay? The argument is that the United States cannot allow Russia to succeed in its efforts to invade and ultimately conquer Ukraine. Some have even suggested that the U.S. should take a more active military role in opposing Putin, specifically by providing more advanced weaponry and perhaps even troops. Okay? Those are general arguments. And usually when we get into discussions with people, maybe even arguments, this is how we usually say it. We make these general kinds of arguments. What I want to do, and this is what we did in our classroom setting back in the spring, is I want to be a little bit more specific. Okay? What kinds of options does the U.S. have? What might they look like? What might it require? How likely is success? What kinds of things might be going on? Okay? Okay. So here are some alternative courses of action for the United States. Option one is to discontinue any further direct military aid to Ukraine. Now notice what I've done here is I kind of took off that nothing. Mainly because that's not likely to happen. There's going to at least be some kind of aid to Ukraine, even if it's just humanitarian aid. But The argument that some are making is to discontinue any further direct military aid to Ukraine. Instead, work with the UN to provide humanitarian aid to Ukrainian civilians and refugees. Okay? Option 2, continue additional U.S. direct military funding. Again, what we might call the status quo, although again, as I've noted, that is somewhat in limbo, simply because, as of right now, there isn't any additional funding. Many have asked for the U.S. to give, Zelensky has asked for additional funding. It doesn't look like that is coming forward anytime soon. As I mentioned, the Biden administration wants the $24 million. That was taken off the table. The House doesn't even have a Speaker of the House. You can't do any business unless you have a Speaker of the House. So we're talking, right, months maybe before any additional funding could get there beyond what, as I mentioned previously, the President can do in his presidential draw authority, right? That we can take existing funds, but now play this scenario out in your mind with what happened in Israel. Funds are finite, right? These resources are finite. There are going to be many arguing that money that maybe should have gone to Ukraine, or they wanted to send to Ukraine, instead, they're going to argue that that money should now go to Israel, and or that military weaponry. Whatever forms of support the U.S. has to give, the argument is going to be maybe it should now go to Israel instead of Ukraine. Or at the very least, there will be less support or less funding, fewer resources for Ukraine as we try to orient towards Israel. So that's a distinct possibility as well. Given the makeup of the U.S. House of Representatives and controlled by Republicans, you could probably see that there will be more support for supporting Israel than there necessarily will be for Ukraine. Okay? So there's a lot that's kind of up in the air right now, and we're not exactly sure what's going to happen moving forward. Right? All right, option 3. In addition to option 2, set up a NATO military resupply effort wherein more advanced weaponry requested by Ukraine is granted. I did not include troops here. Cited against that simply because I think that would be a non-starter to actually send troops. That does not mean that the U.S. would not be willing to send personnel there to teach Ukrainians on how to operate certain equipment, right? In fact, they've done that with F-16s. They've done that with M1 Abrams tanks, right? They've sent people there to help them, but we're talking about troops on the ground fighting against Russians. That's not very likely, okay? For obvious reasons. Option 4, in addition to option 3, use NATO naval and air forces to interdict Russian counterparts operating in the theater. I had options 4 and 5 with my students just because we wanted to see what they would think about that, okay? And it was really interesting. In fact, in their PowerPoint presentations, when we got to option 5, engage in a full-scale NATO military operation only short of attacking Russian forces inside Russia and or using weapons of mass destruction. Most of their PowerPoints had mushroom clouds in because they didn't like that. They didn't like that option very much, okay? And so, in the interest of time, we'll argue that at the present moment, completely withdrawing, as I noted, all aid to Ukraine, and options 4 and 5 are not on the table, and they're not likely to be on the table. So it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to go through all of the details about what that would look like and how likely it is. Should we do those kinds of things? It's not going to happen. They certainly could be, depending on evolving conditions on the ground and Russia's actions. I mean, if Russia escalates, it's certainly possible that that might happen.
Is your mic on?
This mic is on.
Yeah, that mic went on.
This one.
Sorry, I didn't want to.
No, that's fine.
There we go.
Sorry about that.
No, you're okay.
Okay.
Sorry about.
Oh no, I feel like I'm in the ICU. Okay. Let's talk a little bit now about what criteria or dimensions should we use to evaluate those three primary alternatives, right? Option one being let's get rid of the military aid or cease military aid. We'll just send humanitarian aid. Or option two, stay with kind of the current sort of thing where we're offering military aid, we're offering humanitarian aid, and we're offering financial aid, and keep that going, right? Right now it's kind of stalled a little bit, but what if we kept that going? And or then option three, which would be to increase the types of weaponry and make more advanced weaponry, some of the things that Zelensky wants, right? That we've been somewhat hesitant to give because we're trying not to escalate from our perspective per se, right? So the literature commonly refers to four main dimensions, okay? And again, we do this because again, part of my point here is to help us to think a little bit more systematically about these options and how we can compare and contrast and come up with what we think are options that are the best option per se, given all that's going on in the theater, okay? One is an economic dimension. And what we're talking about with an economic dimension is domestic and international economic costs and benefits. Okay? No matter what option we choose, we should be able to judge that based on these economic grounds. Finite resources, billions of dollars, right? Billions of dollars spent here means not money spent here or less money spent here, as I was just talking about with Israel. If we're spending money there, Ukraine, we're not spending it over here, or we might be spending less, et cetera, et cetera. Politicians, oftentimes, right, they want to spend money in some places, but they don't want to spend it in others, and that's why we have these battles, right? We have these battles because there's scarcity, right? Another dimension is the diplomatic dimension, very important. Here we're talking about reputational costs and benefits vis-a-vis other countries, including allies and enemies, okay, as well as with international institutions. So what do other entities think of what we're doing? That can be, as I noted, allies. We don't want them to think we're abandoning them. Okay? Allies get a little skittish when they think we're abandoning them. I've written on the US-China-Taiwan triangle, and there's a lot, for example, that goes on in Taiwan when the US starts to pull back a little bit from promising to protect Taiwan. Sometimes those things aren't very good, right? They want to do things themselves that maybe we don't want them to do, okay? So there's kind of a catch-22 there. With enemies, right? Again, this falls back on what we often refer to as deterrence, okay? We want other states to understand what it is we're willing to do. And sometimes that communication is more straightforward, sometimes it's a little less straightforward, okay? As I did some research, lots of research for this, many scholars are pointing out that their argument is that Putin's been testing the US, right? 2008 in Georgia, 2014 in Crimea, right? If the US isn't going to act, well, then maybe I can proceed unfettered, right? And the US isn't going to do anything. And we don't want miscommunication, okay? If anybody's ever read John Stessinger's book, Why Nations Go to War, that's his main theme in the book is misperception. Other states don't see or don't recognize the messages that you're trying to send, and they take risk, they engage in risky behavior, which then can oftentimes lead to war, okay? Domestic political costs and benefits for an administration. Now maybe you're saying to yourself, well, that sounds fairly crass and narrow-minded. The president and his administration is going to do whatever's in their best interest? Yeah, because they want to stay in office. And there are many theoretical arguments that point to that's exactly what leaders do. They tend to avoid undertaking actions that may cost them in the next election. If we're talking about a non-democratic country, they don't want to engage in actions that might lead to them being put up against a wall and shot, right? They don't want that either. So they have to think about, even in non-democratic societies, what are the people, what's their reaction to what I'm doing? And how's that going to affect me, okay? And then the last one here is military. Costs, benefits, of course including human lives, and the feasibility of any unilateral/multilateral military action, okay? Military leaders, I remember Colin Powell in the Iraq War, you know, he had his beef with Madeleine Albright about, hey, you got this military, what good is it if we can't use it? And Colin Powell's going, wait a second here. We're talking about human beings in the military, and we have to make sure that if we're going to engage in any sort of military action that we will be successful. We don't want to just engage in this and lose, right? Okay. The question then is, how should we rate these dimensions in terms of importance? Well, there's no easy answers. We could weight them roughly equally. The literature, as I noted, often argues that decision makers weight the political dimension most heavily, arguing that leaders will not engage in actions, of course, that would jeopardize their power. They want to stay in power, okay? They want to get elected if there's another election, okay? Okay, so let's evaluate each of these options, okay? And here I'm going to just hit some high points. I'm not going to go through every single dimension just for the interest of time, because I want to leave time for y'all to ask whatever questions you want to ask, okay? So, evaluation of option 1. We're going to discontinue military aid. We're just going to do humanitarian aid. We're kind of pulling back, okay? And these are some numbers, by the way, that we came up with in our class. The students did most of these. These were group projects, which of course they loved. No, students do not like group projects, okay? Because unfortunately sometimes there are free riders and they don't work like they should, okay? So basically the argument was, okay, economic +5. This is on a scale of -10 to +10. The argument is, okay, if we're not sending as much aid, we're going to save money, okay? We're going to save a lot of money. In doing this research, the U.S. has spent vastly superior amounts of money in Ukraine than they have in many other conflicts, right? And in many other situations. That roughly 77 billion is a huge number, okay? A huge number compared to what we've given to Israel, Turkey, Egypt, et cetera, et cetera. Now, it's not much compared to the GDP. It's 0.33% roughly, so it's not a lot, but it is a lot, okay? Diplomatic, as you can imagine, -7. If the U.S. withdraws this military aid, financial aid, humanitarian aid, its allies in Europe would be apoplectic, right? They would be so upset because we would be withdrawing, and the U.S. is far and away the biggest provider of military aid to Ukraine right now. Germany is second. Other EU actors have given a lot in financial aid, but not much of anything military. The U.S. has given the most military aid. So that would be devastating for the United States diplomatically. Politically, would not be very good because the Biden administration has, in fact, there's been news reports that Biden's been on the phone with European leaders saying, yes, I know we didn't get the extra 24 million, but I'm working on it. We still have your back, right? He's worried about U.S. relationship vis-a-vis other European countries. Military, this one was really tough because obviously if we pull back, that means there's no chance of sending troops and therefore we reduce casualty rates, etc. The flip side of that, as some people argue, is we could be making a lot of money selling this equipment. That's really tough. So we kind of focus primarily on the diplomatic and political. This cumulative rating is -1 overall. What's the most likely outcome? What's the most likely outcome? Russian victory, absent significant increase in military aid for European countries. Right? That would be a very tough pill to swallow for the United States. Reputationally, you spent all this money. We shouldn't fall prey to sunk costs psychologically, but we do. But that being said, right, that's not very good, right? You probably would certainly have a Russian victory, okay? Option 2, this is that status quo, right? And I'll go through these again very quickly. Economic, obviously the big thing just to note here is you flip the script on the diplomatic and the political, right? If we continue that aid, other European countries are going to be much happier that we're still in the ball game, that we are the big actor, right? There's obviously an understanding that the U.S. has some of the most sophisticated weaponry. Yes, a lot of the stuff we're sending Ukraine isn't the best stuff, but it's a whole lot better than what they've had or what they have, right? So that bodes very well for the United States diplomatically. Politically as well, right? Biden, he's being consistent, right? He's being consistent. He's been on this path since the beginning. And by the way, Congress did approve the initial $40 billion outlay, right? So that money, Congress is with him on that, although some of those things are changing a little bit. And I might talk about that in a second, okay? Cumulative rating +6. What's the most likely outcome? A continued stalemate. But for how long? This is the great uncertainty. We don't know right now how this is going to happen. Again, the research, the data shows that in interstate wars, 25% end within the first month. Another 25% end within the first year. Unfortunately, those that last longer than a year usually last 10 years or more on average. Once you exceed that year, it's going to last a while, and that's the way it's looking now. It's looking like this is going to keep going for reasons that I might get into here in a minute, right? Putin doesn't seem like he's going to back down, right? His reputation's at stake. He's the one that engaged in this. Zelensky certainly isn't going to back down. This is his country, right? And they are having success, so he's not going to give in. So it's likely to keep going for some time, okay? All right, the last one, advanced weaponry. All right, we start ramping things up. Somehow the Congress comes through, et cetera, et cetera. We start doing more advanced weaponry. And again, quickly here. Problem, diplomatically, I'm guessing there are some in Europe. Other countries would probably be happy with that because we're helping out to an even greater degree. Politically, that could be an issue, right? Because Biden's facing increased pressure from Republicans. It's also the case that the American public tends to be very war-weary. This has been going on for 18 months. The data, recent polls by the Chicago Council on Foreign Affairs shows that barely over half of the American public is still in favor of continuing aid to Ukraine. That happens in almost every conflict, right? The approval ratings, let's keep involved in this. It starts off really high. Even the Persian Gulf War always comes down, right? People get tired of the situation and they want to move on, okay? We could go into some of the reasons for that, but I'm probably not going to right now. Cumulative rating -4 overall. Why? Why? Well, here's the problem. Most likely outcome. Is there going to be a Russian capitulation or settlement because we ramp things up? Not likely. Yeah, Putin is in this thing. It doesn't look very good, right? How about a wider war, right? A possible de facto World War III. There's lots of articles on that if the U.S. gets involved to a greater degree, once you get in, it's hard to get out. And if you're supplying more weaponry, and Russia pushes back, Putin pushes back, then it's the constant escalation, and before you know it, you're in World War III, okay? Okay, so let's wrap this up. Preferred option across all 4 dimensions, at the current moment, seems to be option 2, right? Continue this aid to hold Russia at bay, right? They've had some successes, obviously, Crimea, the Donbass region. They had gone farther in. They were pushed back. I don't even want to try to pronounce some of the names of the places there in Ukraine, so I'm not going to. But we're in this stalemate right now, right? The justification is that this strikes a balance between more isolationist views of what's in the national interest versus a more expansive conceptualization. The trick, right? The tough part is how to support Ukraine while simultaneously avoiding being dragged into a war with a nuclear power. And if the United States even increases that, let's not forget China, North Korea. They've already been helping out to some degree. The last thing you want, as I was reading, I kept seeing allusions to the Korean War, right? And when the Chinese stormed over the border with 300,000 troops, that was the end of that. And then all the conflict between MacArthur, right? It was not good, right? Because you're making that fire bigger, okay? Caveats. This is the current situation. Things could certainly change, right, if Putin decides he wants to do something more. It doesn't seem that way right now. I read this article that they referred to Putin's actions as the same as the US in the Korean War. Self-imposed rational restraint, interestingly enough. And it seems that's, in a sense, what Putin is doing. He hasn't upped the ante. He hasn't become more belligerent. He's doing some things. Now, that simply could be because his military isn't as good as he thought it was, right? That's certainly possible. But he has talked again about tactical nukes. The other caveats, this assumes support from the American people to continue this, which might not be the case, right? Okay, let me do this. I want to conclude with this, okay? Oh, so if you haven't, Foreign Affairs back in July, August, tell me how this ends is really, really good, okay? A lot of these scholars are pointing to trying to pursue something along the lines of a Korean armistice. We're not going to stop. Neither side is going to quit per se or give in. And you just accept the current state of affairs and you have guarantees of United States, Ukrainian sovereignty, right? Russia, don't try anything because we will come back again if we have to. And that's been working along the 38th parallel for 75 years now, right? Not very nice, not very clean, but it seems that might be the direction we're heading, unless somehow Putin manages to completely implode or somebody overthrows him. Even that's not good, by the way. The data and the literature show that autocrats, when they are deposed, they're not replaced by lovely people who love democracy. They're replaced by other autocrats, okay? And it might be the exact same thing all over again. What I want to do here is just give you some food for thought. And unfortunately, I'm going to have to do this, okay? This comes from Robert Kagan. I'll end on this. This is from Robert Kagan. Maybe you'll recognize the play on this quote. A free world if you can keep it. Benjamin Franklin, right? It's a democracy if you can keep it. Ukraine and American interests. And I'm just going to read a few paragraphs here. What is it that Americans want? Okay. Today, they have been roused again to defend the liberal world, this small L. Okay, let's get that clear. Small L liberal, okay? A free and open society, right? It would be better if they had been roused earlier. This is his argument. Something to get us thinking, right? Putin spent years probing to see what the Americans would tolerate, first in Georgia in 2008, then in Crimea in 2014, all the while building up his military capacity. Not well, as it turns out. The cautious American reaction to both military operations as well as to Russian military actions in Syria convinced him to press forward. Are we better off today for not having taken the risks then? That's a tough question to answer, okay? Know thyself was the advice of the ancient philosophers. Some critics complain that Americans have not seriously debated and discussed their policies toward either Ukraine or Taiwan. He talked a lot about China and Taiwan. That panic and outrage have drowned out dissenting voices. The critics are right. Americans should have a frank and open debate about what role they want the United States to play in the world. The first step, however, is to recognize the stakes. The natural trajectory of history in the absence of American leadership has been perfectly apparent. It has not been toward a liberal peace, a stable balance of power, or the development of international laws and institutions. Instead, it leads to the spread of dictatorship and continual great power conflict. That is where the world was heading in 1917 and 1941. Should the United States reduce its investment in the world today, the consequences for Europe and Asia are not hard to predict. Great power conflict and dictatorship have been the norm throughout human history. The liberal peace, a brief aberration. Only American power can keep the natural forces of history at bay. And with that, I'll open it up to questions.
Address the accumulated national debt now, about $34 trillion.
Yeah.
Soon this will be more, the interest of this, and we don't control the interest, will be more than we're spending on all our defense, including the hidden defense dollars being spent in the other, for example, the power, the department that controls nuclear energy.
Mm-hmm.
So we're heading into basically dead swamp.
Yeah, as you said, $34 trillion in debt. The interest on the debt alone is an astronomical figure. So I don't want to be a cynic, but yeah, $34 trillion, that doesn't really stop them from spending more money. I think they're going to continue to spend more money. How do you get a handle on that? Well, you and I, we just stopped spending money. But it's not their money, it's our money, so they're going to keep spending it. Yeah, I wish I had the answer to, okay, what does this mean? What it might mean is, well, I think that's some of the arguments that some are making, right? If we're sending all this money to Ukraine, which is, again, magnitudes greater than any place else, any other amounts of money that we've spent on allies, et cetera, we need to pull back. But of course, the counter argument is if we're pulling back and Ukraine falls, and then I don't want to get into domino theories because a lot of that stuff, right, is not very theoretically sound, but that's the worry. Yeah, that's the worry. Thank you.
Now that we're committed, or at least relatively committed to Ukraine, if we were to pull back, what does that mean for a China-Taiwan relationship? Because to me it seems a perfect example of what you could expect would be a loss of trust by Taiwan, and obviously China being much more possibly belligerent.
That's that argument that Kagan was making, because in his article, that's exact message that he's trying to send is, if we're pulling back from Ukraine, and I want to make it clear, I'm not necessarily arguing, hey, we should be doing X, Y, and Z. I simply wanted to present, here's a way to systematically look at this. But the argument that Kagan is making, and many others are making, yeah, if we pull back from Ukraine, we're sending a message to China, guess what? And one of his arguments that he keeps making, and I tell this to my students, Americans have long done this. This isn't just a modern manifestation. We've had this zeal to make the world safe for democracy, to be out there in the international arena, do all these things, but then it's really messy out there. It's really, you can get people killed, you can spend lots of money, right? And all that stuff that's happening over there, that's over there. Think Washington, right? We don't want to be in these alliances and get pulled into these wars over in Europe, right? Great Britain and France, Thomas Jefferson wanted us to be involved in that and help out the French, and Washington saying, I don't think so. We're not going to get involved in this. Eisenhower, he didn't want to be as involved, right? He said we should be a little bit more, we shouldn't be that committed. But the counter argument to that is the world is a much different place now. It's much smaller in so many different ways, right? Nuclear weapons, strategic nuclear weapons, 30 minutes from here to the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, now Russia. Oh, and it's the same time coming back, right? It's only 30 minutes. The Russians have a 2,000 They have 2,000 tactical nukes. The U.S. has 200, right? 10-to-1 superiority. I don't even want to think about that. But yes, that is a huge concern. We pull back, and China, Xi Jinping is watching. He's watching, and he's looking to see what kind of commitment is the United States making out there in the world. Would we really be willing to defend Taiwan? That's a whole other subject. I actually wrote on this topic, and that's a very delicate balance, right? We have to be careful there. We don't want presidents coming out and saying, "Why, yes, we're going to come to the defense of Taiwan," because then the Chinese get very, very upset. You're supposed to know, but not say. They're supposed to know, but we're not supposed to say it. Okay? It's a very odd sort of relationship. But yes, they're watching. Xi Jinping is watching. And we also know, too, by the way, that Xi Jinping and the North Koreans have been assisting Russia with munitions, et cetera, et cetera. So, post-Cold War, we were supposed to have a more peaceful place, and it's not looking that way so much, right? Other questions?
Anybody on this side?
There's somebody down here.
And then there's a,
How can we decide what to do
Hold it.
with Ukraine when we have conflict in our own country?
They want right here.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, they want you to use the mic just so everybody else can hear, because there's some people using assisted hearing devices. No, that's okay. There it is right there. Go ahead.
I'm just wondering, how can we decide what to do with Ukraine when we have conflict in our own country right now?
Good question. Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, you hope that administrations and representatives, Congress could, juggle at least 3 balls and, deal. And that's certainly the issue, right? I mean, we do have all kinds of problems here on the home front. But the argument that they would use, right, is, and some, of course, would say, well, that's Ukraine. That's way over there. That's not in our national interest. But what happens there certainly can affect us here. As I tell my students, again, the world is a very small place. Everything from the price you pay at the pump, right? You're heating this building with oil, most likely natural gas, all these sorts of things, right? They're interconnected. Businesses, economic issues, all these things. It would be nice if we could, well, the Monroe Doctrine in 1824. Yeah, you guys, you all stay over there. We'll stay here, stay out of our business, and we'll all be happy. And we did that for a long time, more or less, right? End of World War II, you have a new international order, and what's it going to look like? And again, that's that argument Kagan is making. Do you want a liberal world order, small l, okay, small l, liberal, free and open societies, freedom, or do you want an autocratic, totalitarian system? And the answers to that then can be very difficult, because very quickly when Clinton went into Kosovo, for my dissertation I wrote a chapter on this, he said, "We act now to prevent a wider war later." Okay, sounds great. Problem is when you get involved in conflict, you might make things worse. You could be the cause of making it wider. Look at World War I. They all said, we're here to protect our allies, and instead they kind of, made this whole thing explode into a world war. So nobody knows. I'm sure Putin, well, we know Putin thought that within a week he'd be in, I'm going to say, Paul did this too, Kiev, because that's the way I grew up. It was Kiev. Now everybody pronounces it Kiev. Kiev, he thought he'd be there and have the country conquered in a week. And here we are 18 months later, and he's not very close to accomplishing that goal. And it doesn't look like he's going to. So he wouldn't have engaged in it if he didn't think he was going to win. The U.S. wouldn't have engaged in the Vietnam War if we didn't think something positive would have come out of it. Sometimes you have the successes, and sometimes you don't. Right? Other questions?
Yes. The term national interest, isn't that one of the problems in the sense that the definition is so vast and it's different for so many people? When you're talking about national interest, how do you define it?
Yeah, there are whole books and tomes written on that, by the way. as I said, a lot of leaders, I remember watching the second debate between George W. Bush and Al Gore, and they must have, and it was the only debate where there was any discussion of foreign policy. And they both must have thrown out the term national interest, I don't know, multiple times, because it has a gravitas, right? I'm acting in the national interest. These are the things that are important. But as you know, well, what do you mean by that? What are our interests? When I'm working with students, we talk about some of the values that the U.S. has, and certainly that is a free and open society, right? Economic freedom. Why did the U.S. go to war in the Persian Gulf War? Was it to protect poor Kuwaitis? That's why we went to war and beat back Iraq, to help those poor Kuwaitis, right? Well, I don't know about that. Many people might say the free flow of oil at market prices, okay? Because he had his designs on Saudi Arabia, and the U.S. wasn't going to let that happen, right? And George H.W. Bush puts together a huge coalition, beats him back. Another thought that many scholars have is they will then use almost a rank ordering of interests, and they'll say A is national survival. Well, there isn't really anything that jeopardizes the national survival of the United States or our direct security here in the United States. Okay, there aren't many threats to that. B would be the safety and guaranteeing the security of our allies, which some might argue we've spread ourselves too thin. That's an argument for another day. We've got our hands in too many pots out there, but we'll try to protect allies. Then C-list threats to our interests are all those other things that are going on out there. Think about Kosovo. Some might even throw Ukraine. At the end of the day, what sorts of things get threatened the most? It's not A, and it's probably not B. It's mostly those C things. So we spend a lot of time trying to put out these little brush fires. Interestingly enough, it's very different now, by the way, than it was, of course, during the Cold War. Right? When you had a Cold War, it was cold for a reason. That doesn't mean there wasn't any conflict, but there was no direct conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union because you didn't want two nuclear powers facing off against each other. That's what makes this current Ukraine-Russia thing so difficult, because we do not want to get into a direct conflict with Russia. That's the last thing you want to do when you've got another nuclear armed nation.
Question over here.
On the four criteria for ranking, they seem like they're all objective rankings or criteria. But shouldn't there be a criteria that is more personal?
As in leadership?
When you think about how one might rank, if in fact each of us was to rank going into Ukraine, we probably find that there's a lot of people in this room who have associates or relatives that are from Eastern Europe.
Yep.
And they would, if that fifth category was as one of the four, or in addition to the four, wouldn't you get some different results?
That's possible, yeah.
Bringing the personal.
Yeah, you certainly could. One of the difficult things about leadership, as I tell my students, as a component of power, leadership is one of those nebulous components of power. You don't know if you have it until you need it. And you're certainly correct. Any one of us could have maybe put some slightly different numbers there, right? It kind of depends on the situation. What I will say is that, almost in a sense what Kagan is saying, the U.S. has a tendency, and or the American people as a whole, not obviously individuals, but as a whole, tends to not want to be involved in these things, right? We've got enough of our problems at home, until something bad happens, and then, as he uses, the verb that he's using, we get roused out of our slumber, right? And we want to do something to then push back. Part of what he's arguing for then is maybe we should be having that conversation before, right? And maybe if we engage in certain policies, we might be able to make better use of deterrence, right? Is there something and I'll throw this out there, I don't know that I have the answer. Is there something the U.S. could have done to deter Putin from going in and invading Ukraine? I don't know that I have the exact answer for that, but I think in some ways that's the argument that Kagan is trying to make, that we should be more involved. But again, this goes back to, there's also research done by the Council on Foreign Affairs that in the American public as a whole, okay, 70% of the American population has absolutely no interest and very little knowledge of foreign affairs. 70%. 70%. And yet, what's the critical issue there? Most of them can vote. Okay? Do we elect our leaders based on their foreign policy acumen? No, we don't. And why? Because very few of them have any. Okay? A few do. Most of our leaders don't have a lot of experience in foreign policy. They just don't. H.W. Bush being one of the exceptions. If you go back far enough, sure, right? Dwight Eisenhower and others. But modern day, they served in the House. They were a governor of a state. They might have been a businessman, right? I mean, they don't have that foreign policy experience. Okay? Very small percentage of the public really pays any attention. And they'd rather not pay attention, right? There's The Bachelor's on TV and, whatever else sorts of things that we're interested in. I have no interest at all, but these sorts of things are, right, taking our attention. Sporting, the Brewers, knocked out after 2 games, right? Done. The Packers aren't doing so well, right? These are the things that we don't pay attention to, these foreign policy, national security types of things. Yes?
Putin realizes, maybe reluctantly, that he bit off more than he could chew.
Great phrase. That's actually in some of the reading that I had. They use that exact metaphor.
He's frustrated not only with the lack of progress, but the failure of his troops to behave, and he's shifted leadership of the military and so forth. But he cannot come out of the war defeated. And moreover, any objective analysis would say, given the numbers of weapons and personnel he can draw on, he won't be completely defeated. On the other hand, Ukraine has diminishing numbers of available people and weapons. And I'm going to mention the dirty word here. Is appeasement a possibility? That is, Zelensky lets Putin have Donbass and the Eastern Strip and Crimea.
Keep Crimea, yeah.
For cutting off the war. In the meantime, Ukraine may be able to recover, get better prepared militarily for another war. Putin can go and say, I've protected our empire, it was under threat. Russian culture, remember the people living in that area, many of them were Russian speakers and affiliated.
Yep.
So they could stay there, and he could be the champion. Is appeasement, I've never seen the word, because no one likes to use it, mentioned in the press.
Great question. So everybody knows what the definition of appeasement is, don't you? It's the act of feeding the alligators, hoping that they'll eat you last. Okay? Now, it's funny that you mentioned that, because that's some of the, in this tell me how it ends, that's what a lot of these scholars are arguing, is that Putin's not going to give in because he started it, and he's this vision of the glorious, we got to have Ukraine for our empire. Zelensky, it's obviously for the Ukrainian people, there's a lot less for the, in terms of numbers of people, money, et cetera. That's why they're hoping that the U.S. continues to help, and Germany and other European countries and everybody else, right? Would they be willing to do that? Well, the argument that many of these scholars are saying is at some point there might have to be that Korean armistice sort of thing going on where, now whether that includes the Donbass or Crimea, I mean, they haven't had the Crimea now for a while, so maybe, yeah. But letting them have more, yeah, I don't know. I mean, again, for him, that would be very tough. The other thing to note, too, what makes this somewhat different is that in the Korean armistice, the U.S. was an actor. We were in the war. We're not in this right now, so how would we broker that? Well, the argument is you'd have to get neutral parties, say the UN, because the Russians and the Ukrainians, particularly Russia, they're not going to trust the U.S. to be part of this, because in their minds, we're part of the problem, right? And they do not, well, and you also see arguments for accepting Ukraine into NATO. What? Yeah, I mean, you want to talk about throwing some gasoline on the fire, right? Let's just have Ukraine in NATO, and Putin will absolutely lose it beyond what he already has, right? So I don't know. That's their argument. What should happen? Is it going to happen? I don't know. That's a tall order for both. In some ways, I might see Putin being more willing to, because he has at least got some more stuff that he can say, hey, I've at least got some more stuff, and we're being forced to back down by these other parties, and we're not, I don't know if forced would be the right word, but we're going to keep pouring more resources into this, right, into a losing effort. Ukraine, it's personal for them. They certainly don't want to back down because that's their country. That's one of the things to this gentleman over here, the U.S. and Vietnam. Vietnam's whole existence was at stake. So they had willpower, right? It was personal for them. I remember reading a quote many years ago, unless the Americans are willing to eat rice for 1,000 years, they might want to rethink their position, right? So for the Ukrainians, they're not going to back down. So that's why we see this stalemate, and it could, Iran-Iraq war, 8 years before, right? And now, what is that end game? I don't have that crystal ball to see into the future. Yeah.
All right.
I'm going to be a little circular for a while.
Okay.
I listened very carefully to your presentation. It seems to be a world of semantics.
Okay.
Differentials. I doubt if the majority of people in this room can sort out the differences between most of these terms. I heard a forecast today, our ACT scores are the lowest they've been in 30 years. Think of that for a moment. So let's look for an end game. Look for an end game for a second. We talk about Taiwan. How many people know it's an island? And that China could easily barricade the water bridges. Very easily, as a strategy point. Plus, we're dependent upon Taiwan for our material pleasure of life. We're also dependent upon China for our way of life.
Taiwan.
So now we look at Ukraine. I've been there. I look at it, and it's a different world completely. But look at Afghanistan. It was 20 years the Russia left, and we entered 20 years. I heard a forecast tonight, you'd be looking at 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And we have no end game.
Yeah.
We look at Israel.
Don't disagree.
Immediate emotionality of this Russia, let's help. So you wonder, where are we going with what we have? I don't have any answers because I'm puzzled, because I remember a lecture from the Chinese professor. He said, we don't have to worry about fighting a war. In about 10 years or so, we're in London because we're picking up most of our national debt. You're laughing.
Oh, you are. It's because that's why I'm laughing, because you're exactly correct. They're financing quite a bit of our debt. Yeah, the Chinese are financing our debt. What I would say is that, so it's interesting, presidents, they're elected for 4 years, 8 if they're lucky. They inherit all the stuff that came before them. They have 4 years to try to do something with their vision of the world. Sometimes they don't have sometimes some presidents don't have, sometimes they might have one vision. George W. Bush had one thing he was thinking about. 9/11 happens, he's got to switch gears. So I guess at the end of the day, what I hear you saying is that, well, there isn't any continuity or consistency for sure. And as you're noting, right, ACT scores, so where are we going to be in 10, 15, 20, 30 years? Boy, I wish I had the answer to that. I'd like it to be a good place for my children and my grandchildren to live in, but I don't know in terms of internationally and what we do today, what are our decisions today going to, vis-a-vis Ukraine, going to look like 5 years from now, 10 years from now? When I don't even know what's going to happen a week from today in the Ukraine, other than it's likely to be more of the same. And by the way, this tends to be what happens a lot with most presidents. They might have a vision of how they see the world and what they think should happen, but most of the time they're trying to put out, I was talking to Paul, he's in one of his positions here, he's trying to put out lots of fires, and that's what ends up happening with presidents. They're putting out this thing. Biden administration, do you think they saw what was happening in Israel before it happened? No, and that's not nothing against them. Israel didn't see it happening. One of my colleagues is Jewish, and he's been sending me articles being published in Israel right now, and there's a whole lot of self-reflection right now about how did we miss how this went down, and it's very fascinating. So I'll end on this with you. Even a smaller country like in Israel, right, much smaller population, in a sea of enemies, still has a difficult time sometimes figuring out what is our place in the world and how are others seeing us and what's our relationship with them, etc.
Military leaders used to say we had to have an end game before we entered a war.
Jake Sullivan himself said we don't know what the end game is. He himself, Secretary of National Security Advisor, yeah.
Ukraine, and then we're looking at NATO. I ask you the question, how many NATO countries are actually supplying and aiding Russia to fight in Ukraine?
Yeah, I don't have that exact number. Yeah, Germany. Yeah, I could tell you instances where I just read a story today that it's not just, I'll throw this out there, because this is analysis and I don't have the citation, but the Biden administration freed up $6 billion in assets to Iran. Well, the research is coming out, it's more like $50 billion. If you look at all of the little places where money comes from and goes to, it's closer to $50 billion. So there's a whole lot that's going on there. I wish I had the answers for you.
We'll have two last short questions, and then we'll call it a night.
I'd like to look at it in a little different perspective, and let's think about what would be the situation in our thinking if our country were attacked and our thousands of people were dying. Would we want other countries to come to our aid?
I think the answer to that would be a definite yes. In fact, the Revolutionary War, we give the French a hard time, but thank heavens for the French. They saved us, right? They really helped out. But I think I had shared this as I was doing my research for this. There's an article written in the journal called The National Interest. After the Revolutionary War, Great Britain and France decided to have their own little war, and the French wanted the U.S. to come to the aid of France. And Thomas Jefferson, yes, we owe it to them. And Washington said, no, sorry. The U.S. was a fledgling country. What would that have done, right? And there was no way Washington was going to expend those types of assets, et cetera, to get involved. So, yeah, I think that's certainly true that we would want others to come to our aid. So, although when the rubber meets the road and the details, and you get into the details, sometimes it's a lot more complicated than that. But sure, certainly we would want that. Yes?
I thought I'd heard at one time that we got quite a bit of our wheat from Russia.
Mm-hmm. Ukraine, actually, mostly. Yeah, Ukraine.
So are there going to be issues with getting resources from either Ukraine or Russia that the U.S. is going to feel the impact of either in the short or long term?
So my general answer to that is we're already feeling impacts, right, in so many different ways. I remember when this first happened, I was reading about Ukraine as a major wheat producer. I don't know if they can rival Kansas, but there's a lot, right? Russian oil to Europe, et cetera, right? we're already feeling those things. If you want my specific answer, I'd have to admit I don't know details, right, of what we were looking at in terms of volume of trade with wheat and or other sorts of valuables that we trade with Ukraine. Not really my area of expertise. I have a colleague who is an international political economist, and so he knows that stuff a whole lot better than I do. But we're already feeling the effects of some of these things. I don't know if it's, I mean, inflation in and of itself, right? Inflation, no, I'm not an economist, don't go there. I'm not an economist, don't go there. I could quote Milton Friedman, right? Inflation is a function of too few goods, right? Too much money in the system, et cetera, et cetera. So certainly, yeah, it might have some far-reaching effects too, not just right now.
All right, I think we might have a couple more questions that people would like to ask the professor, but I think we're going to have to leave those for one-on-one at the front of the stage here. So please come up and chat with the professor, but I'd like to thank the professor for coming and giving us a